All right, so again, just want to formally introduce you all to our session today called Knowledge is Power, a primer on sexual violence and people with disabilities. This is being hosted by Valor with support from Westside Regional Center. And again, my name is Ashley Klein Jimenez, and I will be one of your presenters today. We have a few learning objectives. We really hope that by the end of this session, you all will be able to really recognize the prevalence of sexual violence among people with developmental disabilities, identify some of the root causes of sexual violence, and then analyze barriers that survivors with developmental disabilities often face in being able to access support. So a little bit about Valor. As I said before, we are formerly the California Coalition Against Sexual Assault. We changed our name almost 2 years ago, and that was really to reflect that while we still do provide advocacy, leadership, and policy work in the state of California around sexual violence, we also do a lot of national work. So we are a member agency, and our members are rape crisis centers that line the state of California up and down the state. There are, I believe, 84 rape crisis centers now in California. And our vision is really a world without violence, where the dignity of every person is valued and respected. So we do a lot of prevention, we do a lot of policy work, we do a lot of training and technical assistance to try to build capacity across the state and nation for people to better respond to survivors of sexual assault and also to prevent the violence from happening in the first place. We have an office in Northern California where I am, and then an office in Southern California in Pasadena where Priscilla is. And lots of programs. If you're interested in learning more about us, you can go on our website at valor.us and see all of that. So I mentioned that we are a member organization and that our members are rape crisis centers. Is anyone familiar with rape crisis centers? Do you maybe know of your local rape crisis center? If so, feel free to put that in the chat, or you can also, Zoom has all these emoji reaction features. So if I ask a question and you want to respond using a reaction, feel free to do that. But essentially, rape crisis centers are local community nonprofits where survivors of sexual violence can access free services. So in California, I said 84. There are 83 centers that are providing Californians with free services. And as you can see, every little dot is where a rape crisis center is located. So in Los Angeles County, gosh, there's probably about half a dozen rape crisis centers that are serving various parts of the county. But essentially anywhere in California, you can find a local rape crisis center and access services. And just a little bit about rape crisis centers. Communities and activists have been organizing to prevent sexual violence and support survivors for decades, for hundreds of years, really. But it's only been about 50 years since rape crisis centers became established in local communities and funded by local, state, and federal government to provide services. And so many of the rape crisis centers in California are having their 45th, 50th anniversary this year and in the next couple of years. And if you're interested in learning more about rape crisis centers, I'm going to put links to 2 videos where you can watch to kind of hear the history in California. They also are run often by lots of volunteers. So if you are looking for new volunteer work and are interested in this work, a rape crisis center might be a good place to look. But there are lots of different types of support that are available at rape crisis centers, thanks to the community organizing and advocacy efforts that happened well before my time, funding for these types of services was able to be established in the 80s and 90s. And while we continue to advocate for more funding, centers are able to be responsive and innovative in their approaches to serving survivors and preventing sexual violence. And so there are some organizations that are very large, and there are others that are smaller. It kind of depends, where they're located. There are organizations that are in urban environments. There are rape crisis centers in rural parts of California. But essentially, they offer many of the same services. So all rape crisis centers in California have a 24-hour crisis hotline. It is typically an 800 number. People can call any time of day and receive crisis intervention. Hotlines are also a great place for people who maybe have received a disclosure of sexual assault to get information about how to help. What someone just told me they were sexually assaulted. I don't know what to do. I don't know how to respond. I don't know what to tell them. The Rape Crisis Center hotlines can assist with that. So that is open to anyone, but it can provide a survivor with immediate crisis intervention 24/7. Rape crisis centers also offer accompaniment services when there has been a sexual assault that is being reported to the police and requires a medical appointment. And this would include a forensic exam that may occur after a sexual assault where evidence is collected. A rape crisis center can send an advocate directly to the hospital to be with the survivor during that exam. They can also accompany survivors to any legal appointments if the sexual assault is being prosecuted. They also offer short and long-term counseling. This can include confidential one-on-one counseling as well as support groups for individual survivors. And often rape crisis centers will provide some form of counseling to family members as well. So there's lots and lots of support. The other things that rape crisis centers provide is they can help provide advocacy to accessing other kind of essential needs in the community. So if there are housing needs or transportation needs, rape crisis centers can often at least connect a survivor with another organization that can provide that advocacy. And then rape crisis centers often provide community education. So they can come to your place of employment and talk about their services. They can share about prevention. They can share about supporting people through trauma. So lots of things that are available to you and to any survivor in your life. On our website, there is a place, and I'll put the link in the chat, where you can actually find your local rape crisis center. So I encourage you to do that. It's always good to know because, when you're in a place where you need it, there's often a lot of emotions, and it can be hard to remember how to find that information. All right. I also want to say at any time during this conversation, if you have a question, if you need clarity on something that I say, please feel free to put that in the chat, send me a direct message, whatever's comfortable for you. All right, so let's get into some just basic information about sexual violence. And I want to start by kind of just throwing it back to you all and asking you, what comes to mind when you hear the term sexual assault? And there is no right or wrong answer. It could be a feeling, it could be just what do you think about when you hear the term sexual assault? It could, maybe your answer is, I don't want to have anything to do with it. There's lots of different answers. So I see Heidi, thank you. Heidi says fear. Yeah, very common, I think, when we hear the term sexual assault. Sometimes we don't really talk about this issue depending on lots of things. And so it's actually really important, if we want to get to a place where it doesn't happen, that we get more comfortable being able to talk about it. Frank says alone, hopeless. Thank you so much, Frank. Yeah, so these are not like great feelings that are being put in the chat, obviously. And so that is one of the reasons why we don't like to talk about it, right? It gives us anxiety. Thank you, Ash. It's not something that we, run to our friends wanting to talk about. Joy says it's taken and not given. Sure. Thank you, Joy. Yeah, so lots of different things come to mind when we hear the term sexual assault. And one thing that I hope after this series will come to your mind is that it's preventable, right? There's the piece of hopefulness that it does not have to be something that we just deal with as part of life. Robin, thank you. I see your comment, abuse. Yeah, so sexual assault is kind of like an umbrella term. A lot of times you'll hear people talk about sexual violence or sexual abuse, and that term often describes lots of different types of harmful behaviors. And that can include anything from rape, molestation, sexual assault, groping or fondling, sexual harassment, being exposed to sexual materials, to inappropriate sexual remarks, and more. And the image that is on the screen is really not meant to show like a hierarchy, because all of these types of sexual violence can be very harmful. But we like to think of this as more of a funnel. So violence can begin as something kind of like small and not super taken seriously, and eventually distilled out to more aggressive behaviors and things that I think everyone would agree are super, super harmful. So it can include things like any kind of unwanted sexual contact or attention, using force, using threats, bribing someone, manipulating someone, pressuring someone, tricking someone, or using physical violence. Sexual violence can be something that happens just a single time in someone's life, or it can be ongoing. It can happen for many different years in different settings. Sexual violence and abuse can happen anywhere. In fact, we know that the most common location for sexual violence to happen is actually in a person's home, but it can happen in the community, it can happen in the workplace, it can happen using transportation, it can happen anywhere. And we've certainly all heard stories of that. We know that all forms of sexual violence or abuse are harmful, and all of them can cause the person who experiences it to have trauma, as well as other negative physical and mental health outcomes. And there's been some really interesting research and discovery that's happened in the last several years with the National Intimate Partner and Sexual Violence Survey, which revealed that women who experience sexual violence have significantly higher rates of things like asthma, irritable bowel syndrome, frequent headaches, chronic pain, and difficulty sleeping. So we often think that this causes like emotional and mental issues, but we're learning that the effects of trauma from sexual violence can also cause very real physical negative outcomes. Another question that people often ask is, okay, well, who's impacted by sexual violence? I'm this kind of identity and I live in this place, and so I don't have to worry about that. And what we know is that sexual violence happens to everyone. It affects everyone, either directly or indirectly. Even if you yourself have not experienced sexual violence, you likely know someone who has, even if you don't know that. And it affects communities even as a whole. So people of every age, race, class, religion are assaulted. And the most important thing I think to remember, regardless of who is being impacted by sexual assault, is that it's not their fault. They didn't do anything to bring it on, to deserve it, to ask for it, right? Someone made a decision to cause harm. And that's really where we want to focus. So sometimes the things that we do or say after someone has told us about a sexual assault can feel like they are being blamed. So it's so important for us to kind of think about our language and about the messages that we might be sending to someone who discloses sexual assault, to really highlight the fact that you believe them and that it's not their fault, that they didn't do anything to cause it. Survivors of sexual assault will often blame themselves. And we also know that the first person that they tell, that they disclose the sexual assault to, can have a huge impact on what happens next. And what I mean by that is, if they want to report it to law enforcement, if they want to seek counseling, if they want to just bury it and pretend like it didn't happen, right? So if a survivor is met with a compassionate, trauma-informed response that does not blame them, they are much more likely to seek assistance and actually get a head start in the healing, rather than someone who feels like they're not believed or blamed, or what have you. And you all work with people with disabilities, and so you're well aware that the words that we use are important, and the way that we talk about people and their experiences are really important. And I started this off by saying that some people prefer to say people with disabilities because they feel it's important to highlight the humanity of each person. And some people prefer to use disabled person because they feel that their disability is a defining identity that can't be separated from their lived experience. And victim and survivor are two words that people use to refer to people who have experienced sexual violence, and can be a bit similar because some people who have experienced sexual assault will prefer to use the term victim, others will prefer to use the term survivor. What we know is that typically in the criminal legal system, the term victim is used. So it's typically used by lawyers, judges, law enforcement to identify someone based off of what was done to them. But for many years, people who have experienced sexual violence have said that that doesn't really recognize them as a person. It just focuses on what happened to them. So the term survivor is often used by advocates and counselors, because it recognizes the person for what they experienced as well as what they have done to get through that experience. But with all terms of identity, it's best to call people what they call themselves and what they feel comfortable with, and not for us to impose our personal preferences upon them. So I want to move and talk briefly about consent, and then I'm going to pass it over to Priscilla. The reason that I want to talk about consent is because, as Joy said in the chat, when we talk about sexual violence, that's often the kind of like the defining factor, that someone is not giving permission, that someone is not consenting to the sexual act. The thing about consent is that there is no one legal definition. It varies state by state. So different states have different definitions of consent, but for the purposes of our conversation, we are just talking about someone giving permission, someone consenting, and in order for us to say that someone is giving consent, it has to be actively given, right? Like it can't be mistaken for consent. It has to be clear. it has to be conscious. It has to be informed. So someone has to know what they're consenting to, right? We can't just ask someone. And I encourage you to think about consent outside of like a sexual relationship and just think of it in terms of like any instance in your daily life. So if a coworker came into my office right now and said, do you want this? And I don't see them holding anything. I can't say yes or no because I don't know what this is, right? What am I consenting to? It's not informed. If I say, what is this? And then they tell me and they say, do you want this coffee? And then I say, yes, now it is informed. I know that I'm consenting to being given coffee. Obviously, when it comes to sexual assault, it's not as easy as being asked if you want coffee, but it does have to be informed. You have to know what you're consenting to. It also has to be ongoing. So it is entirely possible for someone to consent to having sex with someone one day and not consent the next day. It's totally reasonable that someone would consent to one form of sexual activity and not another form of sexual activity, right? The consent has to be continuous and ongoing. It also has to be voluntary. So someone, being forced in any way, including being threatened. If you don't do this, I'm going to tell your parents that you snuck out of the house. That is not voluntary consent. That is consent under duress, right? There's something is being threatened. And it also is required, right? Like you have to get consent. Someone cannot just assume that you're giving consent because of a relationship, because of how a person looks, because of maybe a compliment that was given, right? It has to be, it's required. So consent can kind of be a good place to start when we're thinking about not just how we can educate people about sexual violence, but also how we can prevent it. So we know that consent doesn't just apply to sexual situations, right? I gave you the example of a coworker coming to my office. It's important to ask people for consent for anything that affects people and their bodies, like assisting someone with toileting, with dressing, touching an assistive or mobility device. I'm sure you are asking for consent all the time when you're working with people with disabilities. It has to be given freely. I said that it can't be forced, it can't be pressured, it can't be given because you're being bribed or forced in any way. It has to be given each time and for each new activity. And everyone has the right to say no or change their mind at any time. So there's some examples on this slide of what it could look like to be bribed or coerced. And these are just examples. If you loved me, you'd have sex with me. If you have sex with me, I'll give you, who knows, an ice cream cone. Like those are all being bribed and coerced. The other thing about consent is that there are some kind of ways that people aren't able to give consent. So lots of times in the law, it will detail that a person cannot legally give consent if they are drunk, high, or intoxicated, if they're unconscious for any reason, if they're asleep, if they're underage. In California, it does say that if you are under the age of 18, you're not legally able to give consent, and that's where things like statutory rape come into play. If you are unable to make an informed decision, and if you're being asked for consent by someone with authority over them. So there are these other kind of areas where the law says a person would not be able to legally give their consent. We also know that consent can look different for people with disabilities, but not that different. Okay, that's a key point. Legal definitions that we have even in California, don't often consider people with disabilities. And so, when the law was crafted, they weren't thinking about what consent looks like for someone with a developmental disability. And when they do, they often categorize them as being incapacitated or mentally impaired and unable to legally consent. So we also know that can be really difficult when we're working with people with disabilities. In some states, even verbal consent is required. So think about that. How would someone with a disability who's maybe nonverbal, but is able to make decisions about their life, give consent legally if the state law says that verbal consent is required? It can get really, really tricky. We know that for non-speaking people, consent can be a difficult area to understand and explain. Not everyone has the same body language. So it's really important that we know the people that we're working with. So for example, as you kind of look at this list, you might see that we left smiling off of the list of positive consent, because some people smile when they're nervous or afraid, right? That's not necessarily a sign that they like what's happening. Someone who is non-speaking won't speak the words yes or no, but they have other known ways of communicating. And if there's no discernible communication, how can we be sure that they're consenting? That's an important piece. If we're really not sure, we can't assume that there's consent being given in any situation. So it's so important to know how people that we're supporting communicate if it's not verbally. I'm going to go ahead and pass this over to Priscilla now to talk a bit about the prevalence. But if you have questions or thoughts coming up about the consent piece, feel free to put them in the chat and I'll try to get to them.
Thank you so much, Ashley. Sorry, I'm just going to change the pin to myself. So yeah, thank you, Ashley. So we're going to shift over and talk about some facts and figures today for just a short portion. And I want to do something a little bit engaging with you. So we're going to do some polls. But the statistics in these polls are from the National Crime Victimization Survey. And they've only been including questions about disability status since 2016, and we don't really have statistics prior to that. So it's not a huge sample size, but I just want you all to be aware of that and where these questions are coming from. So the first question is, the rate of violent victimization against persons with disabilities is nearly blank than the rate of persons without disabilities. So I'm going to go ahead and launch this poll. Okay, do you all see the poll? Oh wait, hold on. There we go. Launch. I have all the text screens on my screen, so it takes a minute for everything to run. Okay. So you should all see this. Yep, I see people are starting to answer. So the rate of violent victimization against people with disabilities is nearly 2 times more, 4 times more, 2 times less, or 4 times less than the rate for persons without disabilities. So do we think people with disabilities are face violent victimization more often than people without, or less often? All right, it looks like we have 8 people who've responded. I'm going to go ahead and end the poll. All right, and I'll share the results. So it looks like you all said 4 times more, which is correct. Yeah, people with disabilities experience violent victimization 4 times more than people without disabilities. So that is a really high number. So we just want to make sure that going into this, we understand that this is something that really does affect people with disabilities, right? Violent victimization is something that we really do need to pay attention to if we're working with people with disabilities. Okay, and then question 2. Let's see. All right. Okay, let's see. Is this right? Is this matching up? I think we have a different question on the screen, huh? All right. So, true or false? Sexual assault against people with disabilities are reported to police more frequently or more frequently than sexual assault against people without disabilities. Is that true or false? All right, I'm going to give you a few more seconds to answer. Sexual assault against people with disabilities are reported to police more frequently than sexual assault against people without disabilities. All right, I'm going to go ahead and end this poll, and I will share the results. So yeah, not only do people with disabilities experience violent crime, including sexual assault, more often than people without disabilities, but these assaults are actually reported to police less frequently, which we know can leave abusers free to abuse multiple times. All right. Next poll. Let's see. Stop. Sorry, y'all. I'm not super tech savvy, but I have to press like 9 different buttons to get these to come up. Okay. So more than blank % of people with developmental disabilities will experience sexual abuse in their lifetime. So more than 1 time, more than 2 times, more than 7 times, or more than 10 times. People with developmental disabilities are assaulted more than how many times? 49% of people. Okay, let's see. We have 7 people who've responded. We'll give it a couple more seconds so that we can get a few more answers in. If anyone else wants to weigh in. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and end the poll and share it with you all. Okay, so most of you are right. More than, oh, sorry, people with abuse. Okay. More than 49% of people with developmental disabilities are assaulted 10 or more times in their life. So some of the things that we know about survivors are similar to survivors with disabilities are similar to what we know about other kinds of survivors, right? The majority of people who are harmed, either with or without disabilities, know the person that harmed them. It may be a friend or a family member, a coworker, a support staff, an acquaintance. And the people that are committing these crimes are really frequently folks that we do not want to think would do something like this, or the people that could cause even more harm to a survivor if they're reported. So partially because of this, we see that folks with disabilities are assaulted more and more frequently, and abusers are often in spaces where they're free to abuse other disabled people as well. And then our last poll, more than blank % of people with developmental disabilities will experience sexual abuse in their life. So let me launch that one. Okay, you should see that one pop up now. So more than 25% of people, more than 50% of people, more than 75% of people, more than 90% of people with disabilities will experience sexual abuse in their lives. All of these very high numbers, right? So more than 25%, 50%, 75%, or 90% of people with developmental disabilities will experience sexual abuse in their lives. It looks like this one is taking you all a little bit longer to think about, right? Because these are all really high numbers. Okay, I'm going to give you a few seconds. Okay, great. And then I'll share the results. So it looks like most people said 75%, but it's actually 90%. So more than 90% of people with developmental disabilities will experience sexual abuse in their lives. So a lot of these crimes go unrecognized, unprosecuted, and unpunished, which leaves abusers free to abuse again and again. So survivors are often re-victimized, or abusers will abuse multiple people. So those are really important statistics for us to be aware of when we're working with people with disabilities, because that means that the majority of the people that you are working with have faced some kind of sexual violence in their past. And then talking just a little bit about various identities. Intersectionality is really important in every space, but it's especially important when we're talking about sexual violence. We know that the risk for sexual violence increases for most marginalized groups. So when you belong to multiple marginalized groups, those rates are often increased even further. We know that these patterns are not a coincidence, and it's essential that we're recognizing individuals' culture, background, and lived experience when we're doing any kind of prevention, outreach, or treatment. So now we're going to talk a little bit about barriers to service. We talked a little bit earlier. Ashley just mentioned very briefly that folks with disabilities often don't get the services, or aren't their sexual violence isn't often recognized. So in addition to being at a higher risk, they're also less likely to receive supports and services. So why might that be? One of the reasons is that disability organizations are typically not trained to seek services for sexual assault. So when an assault does occur, service providers turn to adult protective services or an ombudsperson or law enforcement to provide the next steps for them, right? And if they're unaware of community services like rape crisis centers, they may be, or even if they are aware of community services like rape crisis centers, right? They might be hesitant because they know that there are a lot of community services that aren't able to provide the types of services for folks with disabilities. They also might be afraid that if they do reach out to another organization, that they might be compromising any legal proceedings that might happen, right? So they just kind of turn to mandated reporting as the next step and let other folks be involved in telling them like what they should do next, right? All we know, all we're taught oftentimes is like, do the mandated report and then, you know, follow instructions after that. But not knowing other community service organizations to reach out to that can help. So even if they do know of like a rape crisis center or something, it might be difficult to get the access that that person needs, right? Or they may think that traditional therapy might not be suitable for the person that they're assisting. So that's one of the reasons. Also, physical communication, programmatic and attitudinal barriers in law enforcement and legal systems. So people with disabilities may be turned away from legal systems because they aren't seen as credible, or they may be seen as difficult to work with. And if we're relying on law enforcement to make connections to services, that can put survivors in a really vulnerable position because they may need to gain the belief of the service providers or the law enforcement before they're given a referral, right? If they reach out to a disability service provider and that person doesn't believe them, that's where their services will end, right? They won't receive any follow-up. Or if they reach out, if their disability service provider does believe them and they reach out to law enforcement and they're not believed there, then they're not given any services, right? People with disabilities, and especially people of color with disabilities, can face violence from law enforcement. So they may have a history of having violence with law enforcement or may be afraid of law enforcement and don't feel safe turning to them for help. Something that survivors have shared with us is that there's a need for more direct outreach. So making sure that we're informing disabled individuals about the services provided in the community without that possibility of gatekeeping, so that if something does occur, they know exactly who they can go to directly without having to tell anyone else, without having to ask for assistance. And then once a disabled survivor is able to connect with a rape crisis center, they may still not be given the services and support that they need. Many of the rape crisis centers lack resources needed to provide accommodations or the informed care that the disabled community may need. Some survivors have even been referred back to their regional centers for support, and we know that that is not a realistic response, right? That regional centers are not able to provide this kind of support for survivors. Rape crisis centers often don't have established protocol for working with deaf or blind survivors or other people that need physical access. And then some sexual assault forensic exams are also, like, the examination areas may not be accessible for folks with physical disabilities. They might not have lifts or guardrails on the examination tables. And those are some things that, may be necessary for people with physical disabilities in order for them to participate safely in a forensic exam. Many rape crisis centers are also unfamiliar with disability organizations. So they may not think about the need for partnership until there's a crisis situation that arises. So I'd like for you to respond in the chat. What are some of the ways that Westside Regional Center can help overcome these barriers, right? So we know that disability serving orgs don't know about rape crisis centers, that survivors may have had negative experiences with legal and law enforcement in the past, and that rape crisis centers don't have accommodations or training. So can you answer in the chat, what are some ways that we can remedy those things, or some of the ways that we can kind of bridge those gaps, make sure that we're providing care? Bernadette, it looks like having resources available to clients and vendors. Yeah, so that's a great answer. Having resources available, that can look like anything, a pamphlet, a brochure, telling people at your meetings, right? Even QR codes, we're big on QR codes in our work, so that way you don't have to carry around all those things, or people can just, use their phone to scan the QR code and have the information available. Training, yes, resources and training. Yeah, just like this training, right? I'm sure you're going to learn many new things today. Hopefully you'll hear some things that you're already aware of, and we can kind of make some connections for you. But yeah, having resources and training, awareness such as this, yeah, and even cross training, right? So making sure that your local rape crisis center and they know you, and you can kind of go and train with them. They can come and train with you. You can inform them about accessibility and communication for folks with disabilities, and they can inform you about what their services are and how they work. That way you're kind of building those relationships in advance, so that when something does arise, you're not just, in panic mode trying to reach out to people you don't know. You already have that established relationship and that trust with a service organization. Yeah, so thank you all for sharing those answers. Okay, so now I'm going to share a story about moving upstream. So in this story, it's a story that we share in the sexual assault, sexual violence world, but it's also a story that's shared just in many other communities for kind of like prevention stories or like health equity stories, those kinds of things. And so in this story, there is a village, right? And so there's villagers, they're hanging out, and they have a little river going through their village. And one day someone is gardening by the river and they see somebody in the river that appears to be drowning, right? They're being carried down the river. The river's moving really quickly. And so the person on the shore, is frantic. They jump in the river. They try to help this person. They pull them to shore. Person's safe. They're like, okay, great. We're going to get you into the village, get you some blankets, get you something warm to drink, make sure that you're okay. And so that happens, but every day this seems to be happening, and it's happening more and more frequently. So every day there's more people in this river that are drowning, more people. They have to take people from the village to come and watch the river 24 hours a day. They have to make sure that, There's people on standby, people with blankets, people with shelter that can come and help warm them, people that can make tea to warm people up, pull them out of the river. And the villagers are exhausted, right? Their resources are depleted. They start to worry that their people might be drowning while trying to save other people. It's just a mess, okay? So one day the villagers get together and they decide, let's figure out why all these people are ending up in the river. You know, there must be some reason that everyone keeps ending up in this river and drowning. This is not sustainable for us to keep doing this. So let's go investigate. So they send someone up the river, and as they're going up the river, they notice that there's a bridge. And this bridge has a number of problems, right? It's a rickety old bridge. There's loose boards that are falling, railings that are broken. There's people that are every once in a while pushing someone off the bridge. So all these issues, all these concerns. And this is what's causing all these people to end up in the river, is this bridge. So the villagers, then have to come up with a plan, right? They have to make sure that they're figuring out all the ways that they can remedy this, right? They need to repair these railings. They need to make sure that no one's pushing anyone off the bridge. They want to make sure that there's no loose boards, that they're using new wood, right? So this story is really meant to show that like crisis care and healing services are really important, right? But they're not sustainable in large numbers. So we want to make sure that we're taking care of people when harm happens to them, but we're also trying to figure out why this harm is happening and what we can do to change it and what we can do to remedy it. It's also important to know that our environments can shape our experience. So our physical environments, right? They can change the way that things happen or change our lives in certain ways, but not just our physical environments, our social environments. So policies, laws, social norms. Maybe on this bridge, there's a rule that like everyone has to cross at this time. So then it gets too crowded and people fall off, right? But all these things really can change our environment, but we can change our environment as well. So we want to make sure that we're looking at the environments and figuring out what we can change so that those environments don't have negative impacts on us. So I want you to kind of keep this story in mind as we go on to the next questions. Or the next topics. So we want to talk about conditions that create a higher risk for victimization. So at the end of this section, I'm going to kind of ask you to reimagine like what about this topic could be, kind of solved. Like what is a way that you could come up with to kind of fix that bridge, right? So one of the conditions that create a higher risk for victimization for people is isolation and segregation. People with disabilities, isolation and segregation is the next one. So this first one is presumed lack of credibility. So that one's really important because some of the things that we may be familiar with is that people with disabilities are often believed to not know the truth or not understand what is true or what is real. So if someone has a known history of abuse, it can be assumed that any allegations that they make later are just that person being confused, right? That they're maybe remembering a time in the past and they're mistakenly bringing it into their present timeline. Or maybe they're thought to be lying in order to receive special attention, right? This is something that survivors have shared with us, that people don't believe them. People think that they're lying, that they want attention, or that they don't understand what is true. So one of the things that create a higher risk for victimization is assumed lack of credibility, because people who are doing harm know no one's going to believe you. So they can cause harm to that person and be fairly assured that no one's going to believe them if they tell. Another risk is isolation and segregation. People with disabilities are also more likely to live in isolated environments or participate in segregated activities. If the only people that you're routinely around are friends, families, and coworker of that person that's harming you, they may not want to believe that that person would be doing this, right? They may also not think it's possible that they've overlooked something like that, right? Like, oh, I see this person every day. There's no way that they could have been abusing them. I would have noticed that, right? This must not be true. Additionally, abusers may seek out these opportunities because they know that they might be able to easily exploit that and exploit the trust that they're given. People with disabilities are also exposed to many unfamiliar people. We know that, especially since COVID, but even long before that, there's really high rates of staff change in disability service provision, right? It's been really difficult. But people with disabilities can often be forced to rely on abusers in order to get many of their needs met. So if they know that they report someone, then that could cause them to be without the care that they need, right? Especially if an abuser is someone in your family, right? That person may be taking care of you in certain ways, but they're also causing you harm. So if you report them, who's going to help take care of you, right? They also may not want to report if it's a family member because they don't want to cause any problems in their family, right? That's something that can be a huge issue with family dynamics if you're saying that someone caused you harm. Economic instability. So we also know that people with disabilities are more likely to live in poverty. And living in poverty can cause people to have to make really hard decisions. So family members or roommates could be the ones causing harm. And acknowledging this might increase financial instability. If your family has like a boarder or another family member that's helping to pay rent or other necessary bills, you might be less likely to ask for help because you know that if that person leaves, it'll have a direct impact on you or the rest of your family. Devaluation. So people with disabilities also have a fear of being a burden to their friends, their family, or their support systems, and that they are reluctantly put up with, right? This is a fear that many people with disabilities have shared, that like society devalues them and makes them feel as though they're a cost to society, right? And they can feel like that's true in all of their relationships. So this can cause people with disabilities to assume that not only are they lucky to have someone in their lives, right? Like if it's a partner that's abusing them, you know, they may feel like, oh man, I'm lucky that someone's even willing to be my partner, right? Because society devalues them so much. But they may feel like they're further burdening the people around them that support by asking for help. Negative messaging about relationships and sexuality. So people with disabilities often receive messages that they're sexually and romantically undesirable. So kind of like I was saying before, when you're in a relationship as a person with a disability, it may be harder for you to leave an abusive relationship because you're constantly receiving these messages that you're undesirable or that no one would want to be with you, right? And abusers know this. They know that they can use that negative messaging to impact the person that they're with, impact the person that they're causing harm to. We know that other survivors are also told similar things, right? That, you know, no one else would want to be with you. But this message is really reinforced for people with disabilities because of the lack of media imagery with people with disabilities in healthy romantic situations or healthy sexual relationships, right? It can make survivors feel like no one would believe them, or no one would believe that someone is causing them abuse, or no one would believe that this would happen to them, right? And abusers know this, so they take advantage of these negative assumptions about people with disabilities. Also, many people with disabilities are treated like children far past childhood. They aren't taught anatomic names for body parts. They're not taught about romantic relationships or given positive messages about sexuality. People with disabilities experience the same phases of puberty as other people, but they're not given the same space to explore their bodies or have relationships with their peers. They're also not only are they not given sex ed, but if they are given sex ed, they're not given leadership roles. So like you don't see a person with a disability teaching a sex ed class, right? And that can kind of translate to feeling like they don't have personal authority regarding sex, right? If you don't see yourself in that position, like in the media of having positive, healthy relationships, you don't see people teaching you about sexuality, then, that can make you feel like it's something you're not entitled to, as having a healthy sexual relationship or having healthy relationships. And then people with disabilities are often denied the spaces to have romantic relationships. They're not given privacy. They may have rules, right, about not being allowed to engage in sexuality or sexual activity in your own home. This can create a lot of confusion and frustration, right? So if someone's eager to explore their sexuality and they've been consistently denied that, then they may be able to be coerced into a relationship that maybe isn't positive or healthy. They may be able to be coerced to engage in a sexual relationship with someone who has power or authority over them. And that can leave people confused about whether or not their relationship is real. So these are really important reasons that the conditions that we have for people with disabilities, it really does create higher risk for them. And then given little control over life choices. So in daily life, a lot of times people with disabilities don't have control, right? They may not feel empowered to make any decisions for themselves, right? They may be used to having people support them that choose what they wear every day, choose what meals they eat or when they eat meals, what activities they're going to do, even how frequently they bathe, right? That may be not a choice that they're given in their daily lives. So if they're given the space to advocate for their own desires on a daily basis, then that can help them to speak out about other things, right? If you're not given the space to advocate for your own desires, then why would we assume that they would feel empowered to advocate for themselves in a topic that is kind of taboo, right? That can also lead people to not trust their own instincts. If someone who supports you, right, is consistently pushing you to do things that you don't want to do, like, hey, it's time for you to eat. Hey, it's time for you to shower. Hey, it's time for you to get dressed. And you're like, oh, I just don't feel like I want to. Then you're really conditioned to feel like, well, I have to do this because someone told me to. I have to do this, even if I don't want to. And that can be something that is really dangerous for people with disabilities, right? It can make abusers aware that, like, this person is used to quote obeying what authority figures have to say, right? And it also makes people feel like they're used to ignoring how they feel, right? Like, I'm so used to the feeling of doing what other people tell me to, even though I don't want to, that I'm just gonna, do it in every part of my life. And this leads into the culture of compliance that exists in the world of disability support, right? So the culture of compliance, right, is that many people who support people with disabilities expect them to do what they're told, when they're told, with who they're told, right? People with disabilities are often taught from a really young age that people supporting them are authority figures, right? And they need to obey those people. It may be routine for them to have multiple people throughout the day touch them in order to carry out care tasks. And those things can often be done without consent, right? not all care providers are asking for consent when they're doing care tasks. So when you're taught that the people around you need to be obeyed and that they're entitled to touch your body without restrictions, without consent, right? You may not have a sense of how to instill boundaries or even be able to recognize when a boundary is crossed. You also may have a desire to please authority figures, right? Or be easily persuaded by people because you're so immersed in this culture where like you are taught that you must say yes, you must agree to what those around you are saying and that they know better than you, right? They're the ones supporting you. They're the one that tell you what to do all the time. You have to listen to them. And then lastly, people being seen as quote easy targets. So harm doers often take advantage of all the risk factors that we've already mentioned, right? And they may also be doing things like using a person's disability against them. So removing assistive devices, right? Making sure, maybe taking away someone's cane or someone's wheelchair or their communication device, or over or under medicating them as a way to cause harm. So now going back to the bridge story. So what are some of your ideas for fixing these bridges? Okay, so you can respond in the chat just to review some of the things that we talked about, like what are some ways that we can repair these bridges that we see? So repairing the lack of credibility that we see in the world of disability support, right? Some ways that we can repair the negative messages that people receive about relationships and sexuality. Some ways that we can repair giving little control to people with disabilities over their life choices. So go ahead and answer in the chat if anyone has any ways to repair these bridges. So these are like some ideas for combating these negative messages that people with disabilities receive in their daily lives. So Ashley shared with us change laws about how much money people with developmental disabilities can have saved and not have it impact their Social Security payments. Yes, absolutely. This is something that so many people are advocating for, right? If you're not allowing people with disabilities to save money, where does that leave them when they're in a situation where violence is happening to them, right? They can't afford to live on their own. They can't afford to move. They only have enough money to live month by month. It's really hard to do those things. Like maybe it's hard to get a car, right? Somebody with a disability, how are you going to physically get away? That's something that is really difficult too, right? Transportation, super unreliable. So if you have to call access in order to get away from someone causing you harm, that's a very dangerous situation to be in, right? So if we could let people with disabilities save money, that money they save can be used towards safety things like having a car to physically remove yourself from situations, having your own apartment so you don't have to live with the possible harm doers, right? So Bernadette's saying, let's look at what we can affect. Presume credibility. Yes, when you see risk factors, try to put supports in place and that can reduce isolation. Yes. So presume credibility. That one's great, right? So let's assume that everyone we work with knows and understands what's true in their lives. That's a really easy one. So thank you. Increase community connectedness for people with developmental disability, right? Yes, we want community integration. That is what a lot of the goals of day services are, right? Making sure that people are integrated in the communities, that they have that support they need with different organizations, and that they feel comfortable and confident going out in the community. Yeah, great. Ash, implementing person-centered practices and advocacy, amazing. Yes. So person-centered practices and advocacy, right? That's really central to a lot of the work that survivors do, right? Or that advocates for survivors do. It's really similar, right? Trauma-informed care is very similar to person-centered practices. We want to make sure that we are taking individuals and seeing them for the unique people that they are, and understanding that like there's not ever going to be a one size fits all solution to everything, right? Everybody's different, their identities are different, what they need may be different. So making sure that we are centering that person and going to them to find out what they need, how they may need support. Letting them speak for themselves and say, like, this is what I want out of my life. This is who I want in my life. This is my circle of support that I can reach out to, making sure that they feel confident and empowered to make their own choices in their lives at every step of the way. So that, you know, if harm does happen to them, they know who they can reach out to for support, but also so that they feel empowered to speak out when someone's trying to cause them harm. So thank you all for sharing those examples. That's amazing. Now we're going to switch over to some survivor stories. So we're going to be listening to a portion of a National Public Radio investigation and interview series that features disabled survivors talking about their experiences. It may be triggering for some of you, so please do whatever you need to do to take care of yourself, even if that means turning your sound off and not listening to this in the moment. But just know, Ashley put the link in the chat so you can go and look at it on your own time. You can look at it right now as well, but I'll be sharing the audio in this recording. But we do encourage you, if you're not in a space right now to listen to it, that you do come back and listen to it when you're feeling like you can take in this information. The segment is about 8 minutes long. So for those of you who are not planning on listening to it right now, I'm just going to let you know, you can take an 8-minute break. And then we'll come back and we'll talk about it a little bit. It looks like we might have time for a very short breakout room, but I'll go ahead and play the audio now. So for those of you who aren't in a place to listen, come back to us in about 7.5, 8 minutes.
Somebody with an intellectual disability, by definition, has difficulty learning or reasoning or problem solving. But one thing I've learned from my reporting, they often think deeply about the things that affect them, the things that isolate them, like sexual assault.
I felt dirty. I just felt not clean. I blamed myself and I felt powerless.
Debbie Robinson was in her early 20s when she was raped.
I couldn't even look in the mirror because you see, all that comes back to you. It just does.
When the abuse happened, she couldn't even identify it as rape. She didn't get sex ed in school. The older man who abused her was related to someone who lived in her house. She'd been taught to trust him. She knew she didn't like it, that it was hidden, but she was confused. She thought maybe it was a relationship, a bad one.
I had to figure out that it's not my fault. I had to go through all the memories and name it and open up the box that you really don't want to open up. Pandora's box.
It took a lot of therapy. Finding a therapist who knew how to talk to someone with her disability was hard, and getting there was even harder. Robinson doesn't drive. She confided in a friend who then came every week to give her a ride. Robinson didn't want to tell her overprotective parents, and when she finally did tell her mother, she then had to deal with her mother's own feelings of failure and guilt.
That's why people would get angry, is because we didn't tell our own family members. But here I'm telling a stranger, which is a therapist. That gets our families angry.
There's a wide range of intellectual disability. Some people have significant disabilities, mental and physical. Maybe they can't speak or they need assistance from family or staff for basic things like eating to personal things like being bathed. The vast majority, though, have mild intellectual disability. There's a new generation that grows up and gets better chances in school. Some now even go to college programs. But pretty much everyone with intellectual disabilities has one thing in common. They depend upon other people for assistance, and that puts them at risk.
We are taught to trust grown-ups more than anyone else would be, because when you have a disability, people are always telling you, do as that person says, do as this person says. and all this other stuff.
That's Thomas Mangrum. He says he was a young boy when he was assaulted by a deacon at his church. He told his parents, but they never said anything about it to him again. Mangrum says people with intellectual disabilities just aren't believed.
They think if you got a disability, that means you lie. That you can't really tell the truth or you don't know what the truth is.
People with intellectual disabilities often do have trouble speaking or describing things in detail or in proper time sequence. Our investigation found that makes it harder for police to investigate and for prosecutors to win these cases in court. But when sexual assaults go unpunished, then perpetrators are free to abuse someone again. It's one reason the NPR numbers show the rate of assault for this population is so high. Thomas Mangrum, who lives in Washington, D.C., thinks it's a matter of bias.
And a lot of us in the disability community, people don't really see us. People don't see us at all. They just see our disability, and that's it. Ooh.
And yes, sometimes the sexual assault of people with intellectual disabilities does get discounted. In 2014, a judge in Georgia threw out a conviction. He said the woman with Down syndrome didn't behave like a victim. She'd waited a day to report the assault. And in 2012, a psychologist testifying in Los Angeles said a 9-year-old girl who'd been assaulted by a boy at school was likely protected against the emotional trauma because of her low IQ. The jury was so offended, it awarded the girl $1.4 million in damages, far more than the family was even seeking. That kind of thinking that people with intellectual disabilities suffer less gets Carolyn Morgan of Philadelphia angry. She says, we feel the same pain as everyone else.
We do feel pain all the time. Don't tell me that it'll go away.
She knows she's dealt with the pain of her own rape. And she says anyone who denies her pain is ignorant.
They can't see that. They don't want to see it. They close their eyes to it, close their mind to it.
Almost none of the people we interviewed said they were in a relationship now. They said it's especially hard for them, after being assaulted, to figure out what's a healthy relationship and then to have one. Sam Maxwell from Pennsylvania says he didn't know if he could trust anybody.
It took a long time before I had a relationship because I don't know if I could trust anybody.
Now Maxwell travels around Western Pennsylvania telling other people his story. He was abused in 2004 at a state institution by a staff member. The man bought him sodas and candy at the canteen. Maxwell thought the man was his friend until the day he took him into the basement at the institution and raped him. Recently, Maxwell told that story to a group of people with intellectual disabilities. 9 of the 15 in the room raised their hands and volunteered their own stories of assault. James Metters was assaulted by a man from his church in Baton Rouge who befriended him. Metters was afraid what would happen if he reported it.
And I thought he was going to kill me.
But a coworker noticed he seemed depressed, got Metters to say what happened, and got him to call the health information line.
And the information line told me to go to the same hospital. And the same hospital is the sexual assault nurse examiner. And I met a wonderful lady named Miss Wanda. And Miss Wanda really took the time to examine me. And the key of it was that she worked with my pace, not her pace. And the police came and did step by step.
In the hospital, Metters was thinking he didn't want anyone else with an intellectual disability to go through this.
And I remember early on during the exam, I said, I want to change the world. But Miss Wanda and the detective and a friend of mine said, James, you need to take time to recover before you help others.
That was 2005. The man who assaulted him went to prison, and Metters started speaking out to groups around the country. He lives in San Antonio now, and 4 times a year, he helps train the new volunteers at the local rape crisis center. He tells them that people with intellectual disabilities are the frequent targets of sexual assault. And he says it's time to stop keeping it a secret. Joseph Shapiro, NPR News.
All right, folks. Thank you. So I think we have a couple minutes that we can go ahead and do a breakout room. So I'm just going to put you all in a breakout room, probably 2 breakout rooms. We'll just take 5 minutes to go over these questions. I will have Ashley pop them in the chat for you all. So if you can just go over these questions, and then we'll take 2 or 3 minutes when we come back, so you all can share. So let's see, I'll do 3 breakout rooms. Ashley, if you accidentally, and Aberdeen, if you accidentally end up in a breakout room, just feel free to come back to the main room. All right, folks. And then I will also, hold on, before I send you to your breakout room, I got to make sure that I can let you unmute yourselves and turn on your video. So 1 second, I just have to change those settings. All right. So you should see the breakout room window pop up. Hi, folks. Thanks so much. I know there were some rooms that had difficulties with your microphones or people that weren't able to join. But for those of you that were able to join, please feel free to either share in the chat what some of your responses are, or you can come on camera or unmute yourself if you want to share either what your own reactions were to the stories that we heard, or what some of the contributing factors that you may have observed in these stories, or some of the barriers to services that some of the survivors mentioned or alluded to. Does anyone want to go ahead and share? We just have a couple minutes left.
I can share, excuse me, a few things for room 1. We had talked about the first question of the conditions, the contributing factors. It was usually a trusted individual, someone they've known for an extended period of time, so that they built trust, as well as some sort of bribery, or the ice cream cone, for example, something is given to form that trust. And we kind of sort of ended, but for the second one, Joy brought up the disability is a barrier, where if you have, for example, if someone had a speech impediment, so they couldn't convey the message or couldn't be understood. So that's as far as we got. But those were a couple of things we discussed.
Yeah, thank you so much, Ash. Thanks for sharing that.
Thank you.
Yeah, so people maybe even being targeted because of their disability, knowing that folks would have a difficult time understanding them. And then Bernadette also shared in the chat having really big emotions and not being able to imagine what it must be like to not be believed, or to have someone discount your story. I know the first survivor, Thomas, shared that like he told his parents and they just never talked about it again. So who knows if it kept occurring, or if it was just one time and he got the message that like, this isn't something you talk about. So yeah, does anyone else have anything they want to share? Hi, Stephen.
It was something to share, but I did have a question.
Sure.
One of the individuals mentioned that the person who assaulted him went to prison. Do we have statistics on how often people go to prison, get out of prison, and then re-victimize folks?
I don't have those statistics, but it is very rare that happens for any survivor, like that someone actually is tried for what happened, that the district attorney will take those cases. There has to be like a perfect circumstance where they have physical evidence, they have all this kind of proof. It looks like Ashley, did you want to share something about that? You just popped up. Okay, you popped up on my screen right now. So I was like,
oh no, but I think, Stephen, are you asking about like recidivism rates?
Yeah.
Yeah, we can get those figures for you. There's actually been some really interesting movement in California because it's actually not as high as I think the general public believes it is. It's actually much lower when it comes to sexual assault. While we've been talking about how often someone who sexually abuses children and people with disabilities too often has multiple victims, there are a really large number of people who have created harm from sexual violence who have it's only been like a one-time occurrence. So it's really interesting when we start talking about like what the perpetration identities look like, and we can share that in the next session for sure.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Well, just to remind you all, we do have follow-up sessions to this. This was just our first session, but we have parts 2, 3, and 4 that are going to be coming up in the coming months. Ashley's going to put the link for those in the chat. The next one will be about understanding trauma and trauma-informed care. Then we're going to be talking about ableism in sexual violence response and prevention. And then we're going to talk about recognizing and preventing sexual assault. So please join us for those sessions. We will also be recording all of these sessions. So if you're not able to make it to them, we'll have those recordings available, but also share widely among your Westside Regional Center colleagues and disability support providers. We really appreciate those of you who are here with us today. And again, thank you to our partners at Aberdeen for your captioning today. We will hang on here for a couple minutes in case anyone has any questions, but I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording now.